Hey, hi. Welcome to Someone Else's Movie, the original podcast where an actor, writer, director, or nebulous industry figure gives a little love to a movie they didn't make. I'm Norm Wilner, TIFF's Senior International Programmer for Canada, and this is The Other Thing I Do. My guest this week is Anna Fahr, a writer, director, and documentarian whose first feature drama, Valley of Exile, is a story of two Syrian sisters trying to make a new life in a Lebanese refugee camp. It screened in the Canadian Film Fest earlier this year and opens across Canada this Friday, July 5th. And it's very good. You should check it out. Anna chose another story of a refugee finding shelter in an unexpected quarter, Bashu, the Little Stranger. Bahram Beyzai's 1986 drama about an Iranian child who loses his parents in the Iraqi bombing of this southern village and flees to the north, alone and helpless, until he's taken in by a woman named Nayi, who has two children of her own and not a lot of time for him. Simply told and beautifully acted by Anna Fahr and Susan Tazmili as Bashu and Nayi, the film became one of the key international breakouts of Iranian cinema, though it has receded somewhat in the collective cinematic memory. Anna would like to change that. This is Someone Else's Movie.
So it's a film that I fell in love with as a young film student in Montreal. It was like my first introduction to Iranian cinema. And being, Iranian Canadian, I was very fascinated by this new way of storytelling that is very poetic, very performance driven. I was just really in awe, and the film stuck with me over many years. I went on to do a master's in film and Middle East studies at NYU, and so I revisited the film when I was working on my thesis, which had to do with representations of women in Iranian cinema. And so I was able to take a look at the film with a different lens, really focusing on the character of Nayi in the film and what she sort of represents. And so it's been sort of a career-long interest in this film, sort of as a very pioneer film in many ways, as far as some of the great films of Iranian cinema of the 80s and the 90s.
I came to it around the same age, but I'm still sort of dealing with this idea that you hadn't encountered any Iranian cinema before that. I mean, part of it was that it wasn't available, but that's kind of remarkable. I mean, was it? Mm-hmm. I imagine it would have been a transformative experience. I mean, what you were saying.
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, I grew up in Canada, so my, I guess you could say my, the films that I was watching and exposed to during my adolescence were sort of the big American movies of the 90s. So films like Pulp Fiction, Forrest Gump, Reality Bites, like all those sort of really classic, great films, great movies. But very American. And it wasn't until I think my last year of high school, I watched Samira Makhmalbaf's The Apple, Sib in Farsi, which at that time won, I think it won the Palme d'Or at the Cannes Film Festival. And she was like really young. She was about my age at the time. So I was like, who is this girl? And I was still in high school, so I hadn't even, started thinking about film as a career, but I was, again, very curious and intrigued by like this type of filmmaking, which often uses non-professional actors. In the case of Sib, it was the actual girls who had gone through like the experience that the film is presenting. So an introduction to, I think, that very hyper-realist approach to filmmaking that eventually blossomed into a deep appreciation, and then later, influenced my own work as a filmmaker.
It's kind of remarkable that there was this big push for, 5 or 6 years ago, someone tried to call slow cinema a genre, codify that. And it's like they've been making those for 50 years in the Middle East.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And African cinema too. I mean, they're all just very simple and observational in their construction, but they're incredibly sophisticated in their narratives and in their emotions. I remember seeing Bashu, and was either at a festival or at the Bloor when they were doing exclusive runs for, I guess it would have been what Mongrel Media was, or before it was Mongrel. Seville or Malafilm or some small distributor that got the rights and just put it in front of the art house crowd, and it never went away. It was playing repeated screenings, and it ran for I want to say it ran for months, but not consistently. But it would be like a Wednesday and then the next Friday, and I caught one. It was probably in the spring of 1990, maybe, but it was really lovely and quiet. And it's a terrible story about people who are suffering. I don't mean to say it puts a gloss on it, because gloss is the furthest thing from this film. It's about finding hope in the face of mysticism. People keep telling everyone that it's going to be okay and that things will work out and your visions will not be important to you, but it's about learning to interpret your own dreams and trauma and all of these things. And it's not about that either, because it's simply about the relationship between these two people, this child and this woman. But this whole world is contained within it. And YouTube doesn't do it justice. Seeing it on a big screen in silence, with nothing around you but 5 or 6 other people. It was a really sparsely attended screening, but the Bloor had this huge screen at the time, and it was just great. You disappeared into it.
Wow, I can only imagine. I mean, I wish I could have seen it on like 35 in a cinema. I think I probably saw it on like a laser disc or something. So I've never seen it in the quality that it deserves to be seen in. And I mean, in terms of cinematography, there's something magical about seeing the landscapes of Iran. And there are so many different geographies that, as somebody who's traveled to Iran, and I've done kind of these road trips, but I've never gone so far south as Khuzestan, which is the province where Bashu lives and is orphaned and then flees and winds up in the north. And so to see the contrast between sort of that desert, dry, arid landscape of the south of Iran, juxtaposed with the lush green fields of the Gilan province, which is northern Iran, it just introduces you to the diversity of the country, and then going into questions of ethnic diversity and linguistic diversity, which is addressed in the film sort of as the through line or as the sort of catalyst of the story, where this young Arabic-speaking orphaned boy winds up in a Gilaki-speaking province where he can't communicate with this woman who takes him in and speaks to him in a dialect that even many Iranians themselves don't understand. So when I watch the film, I'm trying to like identify words that are familiar to me, and I can't understand it, even though I grew up hearing Farsi in my home being spoken by my parents. So I think it's a very fascinating experience, both for, I think, Western audiences to see this sort of side of Iranian culture and language, and equally for Iranians who may not be familiar even with that kind of a diversity that exists within Iran, both in the 80s and even today, even still today. I think it's a really interesting film.
I had completely forgotten the colorism aspect of it. That Bashu's darker skin makes him even more of an outsider than his inability to speak the language. It came flooding back while I was watching it again, and I suddenly realized that's right. This was shocking then in a theater, because it's probably my own colonialism speaking, but you just don't imagine that sort of ethnic diversity and racism, like active racism, in a smaller culture, like a monoculture like Iran, which isn't really a monoculture, but my understanding of it, mostly probably because of all the Khomeini stuff and the issues of the 80s, was that they were a unified front, and this was simply not a thing that happened. I was aware of the Iran-Iraq War, but those divisions I understood them to be sectarian. And then seeing the film was jolting. And I went back and read some reviews, and people caught it then too, but it completely faded from my memory. I remember images and key scenes, but not that. And it is such a huge part of that first, well, I guess the first hour, really, that first act of the film is all about him not integrating.
And I think that's what makes the film so relevant even today, is that we still confront racism every single day, whether it's here or whether it's in the Middle East. Largely many of the conflicts that we are witnessing are really fundamentally like racist conflicts, and Bashu illustrates what happens when when one can open their heart to the other. In this case, a young dark-skinned boy from the South who speaks a different dialect. But that when we can see that really as a metaphor for any given conflict that we're witnessing today in the world. And so I think that's where the film has that really universal quality, is that yes, it's a very local story about these very specific communities that are real communities. I think the actress herself is a Gilaki speaking woman from Rasht, the city in Gilan province, which is where the film largely was shot. So it's very local and very specific, but it's also very universal because it translates across many different cultures and languages and identities. And I think that that's for me what makes it so powerful and makes me able to watch it again and again without getting tired of it, because I'm always in need of this sort of reminder, because it's a film that, even though it addresses really heavy themes of war and displacement and racism and trauma, it does it in a way that is so beautiful and really fundamentally about connection and what it means to give refuge. And I think that that is something that is so important right now, given what we're witnessing in the Middle East.
Well, exactly. I mean, it distills this message so simply into, this is a child who has nothing. How can you deny him the least of anything? Just
Right.
simple kindness, and then also food, shelter, education, all these things. And there are dozens of movies about this, right? I mean, in every language, it's one of the most simple, primal narratives you can use. And it's usually about an older person who is cranky and becomes less cranky once they take care of a rambunctious child. This, by acknowledging how recent the losses are and how horrible and traumatizing and painful they are and still are for Bashu, it strips away all the convenience of the narrative and just shows you what it would be like for these people. Mm-hmm. And it was just so mature in its statement, and all it is simplifying, right? Like, all it is just Beyzai taking the bones of this story and building on top of them with this minimalism that is almost radical for the era. Because this is coming out in the age of, Lethal Weapon 2 and Who Framed Roger Rabbit and Die Hard. And it's not competition exactly, but it is remarkable to see that the world commercial cinema was starting to chase things like the Miramax imprint, where they'll be in film festivals all over the world, and they'll have maybe one big star that everyone else knows, and you can build around that. And then maybe there's the Oscars and all this other stuff. And I mean, it was made in 1986, so it predates a lot of it, but it's emerging into this landscape. And simply by just not trying to compete and telling its own story straight, as were Kiarostami and Mohsen Makhmalbaf and everybody else working towards this vision of a new Iranian cinema, I think this one might be the purest. Like, Close Up is wonderful because it's filled with gamesmanship and meta filtering and mirrors upon mirrors, but this just gets out of its own way and tells this really simple story in an absolutely compelling fashion.
I like the word pure. It is very pure and innocent in some ways. I think it's ahead of its time in many ways, especially in terms of its representation of a strong female protagonist. because, as somebody who's seen a lot of Iranian films, a lot of films made by Iranians in diaspora, I noticed this tendency of oftentimes portraying women as victims of male violence. And this film did the opposite. It presented Nai, the protagonist, as an agent of change in her society, because she was able to stand up to not only her husband, but also community elders, all of them, kind of mocking her for taking in this little dark-skinned boy. And she challenged them, and she really showed what a strong Iranian matriarch looks like. And, I've seen them in real life. I have members of my family who, when I watch the film, I'm reminded of my grandmother, for example, because she was also somebody who, within the constraints of a very patriarchal society, was able to sort of push the boundaries and become an agent of change in her own life and in the lives of her children, and effectively in the lives of her grandchildren. So I think that element of the film was very avant-garde, not only for that era, because we're talking about post-revolutionary Iranian cinema. We're talking about a time when, obviously the country was going through a lot in terms of the conflict, Iran-Iraq war, but also women's rights, women being forced to wear hijab, women seeing, many of their rights being taken away from them. And yet you have this really powerful female figure in this movie being made in the 80s that stands the test of time even today, I would argue. So I think for that reason, it's something, if people haven't seen the film, that they should definitely see the film, particularly anyone who is an admirer of Iranian cinema. It's just full of richness and purity, like you said.
Hey, it's Norm, interrupting my own show to bring you up to speed on Shiny Things, my newsletter about physical media, culture, and the odd streaming project. Last week I wrote about the gorgeous new Criterion Collection release of the Wachowskis' Bound, just in time for Pride, and this week I'll be catching up to a whole mess of catalog titles. Sign up for a 14-day free trial at shiny-things.ghost.io or find a link in the Semcast Blue Sky account. You like reading about movies? I like writing about them. Come check it out. It's kind of shocking to me, although I suppose it isn't given the way everything is going right now, that there is no decent home release at all. I looked. There are no DVDs. There are no Blu-rays, never. I was hoping that there'd be, apparently it did really well in China, which surprised me, but I was hoping that there'd be a Hong Kong DVD as a result and couldn't find one. And it's odd, given how well it's remembered now by people who've seen it. But then again, I suppose it's, there's been 2 generations of people who've never heard of it at this point. Probably. So, I think the thing to hope for now is that Scorsese puts it in his next World Cinema project through Criterion. But I could absolutely see this. They're trying to do more Iranian cinema. There's never enough Kiarostami. So maybe this is part of another package. But it's lost nothing. So it would easily, I think you could do a contemporary reissue. And of course, I work for a Cinematheque, so I'm going to definitely start asking. But it's remarkable that it's disappeared effectively. Have you, over the years, have you been the, are you the evangelist? Are you trying to get people to see it, or do you run into people?
I've written about it. I have a published article about this film, comparing it with Grand Illusion, the 1930s Renoir classic, where I kind of look at these 2 films back to back as examples of poetic realism that challenge the notions of identity and national difference and things like that. I presented this film. I usually present it in the context of university events. So I presented this film at Oxford when my husband was doing a journalist fellowship at Oxford in 2015, I think it was, and we had an event where we screened Bashu and we talked about the film. And it's always such a joy for me to introduce this film to a young generation of students, whether they're students of Middle East studies, students of Iranian studies, students of film studies. There's so much that you can glean from watching the film and analyzing it, and also analyzing it in relationship to current day events. And it just, no matter where I am in my life at any given time or in any given place, the film still bears relevance to what's happening in the world. And I think the best kinds of movies really are able to do that. And same with some of the, like the classic Kiarostami films, Makhmalbaf, like a lot of those filmmakers that kind of came up a little later, I think in the late 80s and early 90s is where that sort of renaissance of Iranian filmmakers was taking shape. But many of those same directors looked to this film, Bahram Beyzai, his previous works as well, his pre-revolutionary films. So he's kind of like one of the earlier figures or pioneers of the Iranian New Wave, which is why the film is so important within the context of Iranian cinema. So there's a case to be made for why it should be in the Cinematheque and in all university libraries and even like beyond the university environment. This film deserves to be accessible to a wider audience. I mean, who knows? Maybe Netflix will one day discover the genius of Beyzai and his beautiful film Bashu.
I mean, here's hoping. What do you screen it on? What's your source when you have it? Do you have a print handy for these things?
Oh my goodness. I mean, I think at one point I had a DVD of the film. Kind of I would have it with me wherever I went. So I don't know if I still have this DVD available. The last time I watched it, which was last night, just to like refresh my memory, it was just on that YouTube link, and it was sadly very lo-fi. I wish I had a proper screening copy, but they've never been very high quality screening copies, unfortunately.
I mean, that's good in one way because you're getting people to believe they're seeing something that's impossible to find. I know that's definitely part of the appeal of a screening of a film that's very rare. Somehow the 4K restoration on a DCP works against it.
Right. Yeah. There's got to be some 35 prints floating around. I mean, there is a very robust film culture in Iran, and I believe there's a film museum in Tehran. I think it's called like the House of Cinema or something like that, and it has a beautiful collection of old films and props, and so I'm not sure. I'd have to do some digging and find out if there's also some kind of archive that would store some of these prints of like the old films from that period. I would hope so.
Good. Yeah, I would. I mean, I'm trying to remember. There was a documentary a couple of years ago about the desperate race to save a film archive, but I don't think it was Iran. I think it might have actually been Afghanistan. Yes, it was. It was Afghanistan. The NFB co-produced it.
I think I remember seeing that. Yeah. So yeah, if they have that in Afghanistan, then that's something that I would have to ask and find out about, whether there's some kind of organization that preserves old film prints. I definitely would hope so.
There must be. And this kind of logically leads into being that Bashu is a story of a refugee taken in by someone with a kind and open heart. Although grudgingly, it's a whole thing. But that's where the character development comes from. But
Right.
but this does lead us to your film. As you mentioned, it's also about a situation. Well, I mean, I was going to say it speaks to the current events, but of course, the situation never isn't current, right? Like it's an ongoing thing. There will always be refugees, and there will always be people trying to help them. But I will set this up in the intro about what Valley of Exile is about. But we can talk about the the specific resonances, if you like, and how you came to make the film you made.
Yeah, I mean, when I was watching Bashu, I was struck by some of the visual similarities that I don't know if I did consciously, because obviously we shot in Lebanon, so we didn't shoot it in Iran, but we shot it in a specific location in Lebanon in the Bekaa Valley that in many ways resembles northern Iran. So I was like, wow, that's incredible. And like a lot of those sort of lush fields, with the mountains sort of sprinkled in the backdrop, are very, very strikingly similar between where we shot Valley of Exile and and the Gilan province of northern Iran, where Bashu was filmed. So whether that was deliberate or not, I guess it was. It must have been. I mean, the film took so long to make that it's like, in retrospect, going back in time, I'm trying to remember exactly like where these sort of influences came from. But as far as the story, it's definitely in many ways sort of inspired by the humanism of the film of Bashu, especially in the idea of being somebody who's in a position to receive a stranger and what that looks like. And we see that in Valley of Exile in the character of Haifa, who is a Palestinian woman from Syria, who by that point is twice displaced. So she is now displaced in Lebanon. And she is, basically the one to take in these two young Syrian sisters who arrive from Syria. And I think that, yeah, I think the similarities with Bashu in that act of providing refuge to somebody you don't know is very important, I think, for me, in terms of the types of stories and the types of films that I'm interested in making, but also the films that I love watching. And these are films that are embedded in questions of humanity, kindness, love, and the idea that like love can overcome hate, which are very simple and pure themes, I think, going back to the term you used earlier, but still very powerful and relevant, particularly right now.
Absolutely. Well, the thing that stuck with me the most was the sense of this reflexive compassion where, Nai is alone. She has no reason to do the things she does other than she can't not do it. And Haifa has every reason to not want more in her life because she's, twice displaced, as you say. She's got no reason to believe in the system working or have any faith that these people will thrive. And yet it's not an option for her to reject them. And, those two things are the same thing, but those two stories, that first act moment where, I always see things in terms of structure and emotion, but it's not the inciting incident that a screenwriting book would have, but the sense that the character's dignity is revealing itself so soon, so quickly, and so unambiguously that nothing about either decision is selfish. They're doing something completely selfless by taking in new lives, other people's lives. Somebody wrote, I can't remember where this came from, but I love it. It's about falling in love, but it works for almost any situation. The most complicating thing you can do to your own life is to add someone else's. So often people just don't. For whatever reason, they'll talk themselves out of doing something that will help another person, even if it's simply, a job reference, something mundane like that, or holding a door open. And this is like literally holding a door open to the rest of someone's life in both cases. And Valley of Exile, the term is ultimately ironic, I think, because it's where these people are saved. But it is about seeing an individual rather than a situation, and allowing those individuals to become full presences in someone else's world, in someone else's life. And there's a beautiful synchronicity between, or an echo of Bashu in Valley of Exile, even though the stories are fairly different ultimately.
Thank you. No, that means a lot. That means a lot because I mean, I look up to that, the director Bahram Beyzai so much, and so to compare my film with this is quite an honor. But yeah, I mean, I think there's something about also this mother figure that I find really fascinating in Bashu, because of the fact that the character of Nai is so deeply, fiercely maternal, and it almost becomes funny in some moments where she goes to such lengths to rescue this child that nobody wants. Like she searches for him when he goes missing, and when he falls into the river, she throws this fishing net while all the villagers all watch, kind of standing by, not doing anything. And like she's so fiercely loyal to him as a mother, as a surrogate mother. And I think that that was just so touching to watch. And I wanted to explore that question of motherhood, not only with Rima, the character in the film, who's 8 months pregnant, about to give birth, but also Haifa, who's actually not a mother. She's an aunt. So she's never been a mother, but she's at the same time very motherly, if that's a word.
Oh yeah.
Um, so I think, yeah, the act of caregiving, the act of nurturing, and just even the symbolism of the fields that you'll find, the rice fields that you'll see in Bashu. For me, they were wheat fields. So we were shooting in Lebanon at a very lush time of year where the wheat fields were being harvested, and so there's a beautiful sort of metaphor in just looking at that landscape, that fertile landscape that really speaks to the sense of a space of rehabilitation for these women who have basically been left on their own without their husbands to lean on, or brothers or fathers to lean on for support. So it becomes a very sort of feminized space in that way, that I think is also really fascinating when you think about it just in terms of that visual geography of the land, and what it represents to these women, these characters.
I'm trying to connect the visual proposition, right? Like the fact that you have to depict. I mean, you shot in a real refugee camp,
Yes.
and found a way to tell everyone's story while you were there. That's a different sort of challenge, right? That's a different sort of field to draw from.
Yeah, I mean, we were telling predominantly the story of these two Syrian sisters, but we had a supporting cast. So we were telling the story of Haifa, who's Palestinian Syrian, of a woman whose family who became refugee. So we're telling her story. We're also telling Khalid's story, who's a Lebanese engineer working in the camp, and Hassan, who's a Lebanese soldier, who's also kind of working on the outskirts of the camp, and then Shirin, who's Palestinian Syrian, the niece of Haifa. So we're examining different points of views that are often contested in the politics of the region, and therefore there was potential for it to be also contested during production, and even now in distribution, because nobody sees these conflicts the same way. Syrians obviously see it in their way, and multiple ways, because there are Syrians who have different political leanings. So even just like in Iran, where you have like the Iranians from the south, the Iranians from the north. My family's from Mashhad, which is northeast of Iran. My dad's side, my mom's side is Bojnor, which is also northeastern. And so even within one country, you have so many different, possibilities of difference, different points of view, that it becomes very complicated. And to make a film that attempts to give voice to people of different, different backgrounds and different lived experiences can be a very risky thing. And in some cases, I've gotten some feedback from, audiences that are, I think, triggered because it's a living, breathing conflict that people are living through right now in Lebanon. There are still 1.5 million Syrians living in Lebanon who came as refugees. And that's 25% of Lebanon's population. And the Lebanese themselves have gone through one of the biggest economic collapses in its history, losing 90% of their hard-earned savings, having their money stuck in the bank. So they're suffering as well. And so it's just sort of an ongoing cycle that in the film, I was very conscious of the fact that we're treading on very sensitive ground. And that's why we always kind of wanted to go back to those core themes of love and, acceptance and what it means to take in somebody who needs help, somebody who needs a place to go, somebody who needs a place to sleep just for the night. Just those simple things, those acts of kindness that you were saying, like people just don't do them. But what is it? What does it look like when you do? That's what the film is really about.
Yeah, it's ultimately, I think it's a film about comfort, and it is a comfort at the same time to people who've come through it, to see that it, fictional or not, this is a story that feels true. It feels like you've built it on endless stories of this exact situation. And like Bashu, you watch it and you feel a little bit better about humanity in general, I think. It's just, I hesitate to describe any refugee story as a feel-good narrative, because that puts people in mind of another kind of Miramax movie, right? And this is not what that is.
No. Yeah, it has to walk a fine line. I think it can't be, in some ways, too somber. It's tricky because you're trying to tell a story that resonates in reality, that reflects a certain reality, a certain portrayal of a lived experience that people have sadly had to go through. And so, but at the same time, you do want to be able to connect. You want to connect the audience to these characters. And that's where that sort of universal depiction of, the fierce love of a mother towards her son comes in, and that son just happens to be an orphaned boy who has no more family and has nowhere to go, and who everyone looks at as the other. But still, you find it in your heart to, give that child the home that he deserves. And I think at the end of the film, near the end of the film, she gets mad at him because he's sleeping in some like hut or something, or some, like straw bed, and she comes in and she looks like this, like ghostly. Her eyes are so piercing, beautiful eyes, but she's fierce. Like, she's like, what are you doing here? You have a bed. Go back to your bed and sleep with the other, with your brother and sister. She has convinced herself to that level that she is his mother, and she will not allow him to feel like an other in her house. He will be a son to her, because that is who he now has become to her, which I think is just such a beautiful, strong statement. That's just is still so important for people to remember.
I was on a jury in Montreal. I was on the Pressy jury in 2003, and Samira Makhmalbaf was there with her film. And it was great to watch, a second generation of Iranian cinema rear its head and be embraced and roll forward. It was a blast.
Yeah, no, she's done some really incredible work. And I think, her father, her stepmother, like that whole
Oh, it's a
family.
dynasty now, yeah.
That whole family has done some really interesting work over the years. And now obviously it's like, we're seeing things like the Asghar Farhadi's films get recognition. So it's evolved. It's evolved from the era of these sort of very sort of metaphor heavy movies of the 90s to become a little bit more stark realism with a little bit more explicit sociopolitical commentary, I think, is where Farhadi has taken it. But I mean, it's tough because, obviously, as you know, it's hard to make films in Iran. It's hard to kind of navigate censors and deal with all that. And now with all the political turmoil happening, it's even harder for filmmakers. So I always am like in full awe of these filmmakers because it's like not only are they making work against really, really difficult circumstances, but they're making really good movies. I mean, even if you had no challenges or no censorship to deal with, like that, even that in and of itself is hard to do. So yeah, I'm always just, really amazed. And I hope that I can add like a little perspective that is not like fully Iranian, but not fully Canadian and, not fully Lebanese. Like I'm kind of like the in-between person, just doing films a little differently, but still kind of drawing a lot of inspiration from people like Samir Mahmabaf and Beyzai and all of the all the others, and Bania Tamad, Rakhshan Bania Tamad Gilane. I'm not sure if you have had
No, I recognize the name, but I'm not sure I'm familiar.
She's like the godmother of post-revolutionary Iranian cinema. So she's been, because it's a boys' club, so she's really been sort of the champion of, as a female director, making really solid films for like the last 3-4 decades.
Wow. I must have seen at least one, but I'll go, I'll read up on her.
Yeah, she's fantastic. Her films have done well, but she's not a household name like some of the other figures, like Kiarostami or Asghar Farhadi. But she's still within Iran very, very well respected. And also like her films have traveled. So it's a good question to wonder why isn't she a household name? She should be, because she's as good as those guys.
My thanks to Anna Fahr, whose first dramatic feature, Valley of Exile, opens across Canada this Friday, July 5th. Thanks also to Alia Stationwala. She knows what she did. You can find Anna on Instagram at Anna Fahr, all one word, and as she mentioned, you can find Bashu on YouTube. Here's hoping we see a proper restoration, or at least a proper release, sometime soon. You can find me on Blue Sky at Norm Wilner, and you can find this podcast there at Semcast, SEMcast, and on the web at someoneelsesmovie.com. The first year of the show is still available for just $20 at payhip.com/Semcast. That's the first 52 episodes of Someone Else's Movie, 44 of which aren't currently available anywhere else. And check out my newsletter, Shiny Things, at shiny-things.ghost.io. I think you'll enjoy it. Our theme song is by The Last Year. If you like it, or the show in general, please say so. Leave a review wherever you've been listening. Every little bit helps, it truly does. And check out the other shows on the Frequency Podcast Network while you're doing that. Stay safe, watch movies, wear a mask if you go out, get the new booster when you can. I'll see you next week.